who are not on the inside of our group, inside our group, right? I mean, you shouldn't actually have to say that to Christians because by definition, the word Christian means Christ-like, and Christ was actually very accommodating even to the worst of society, wasn't he? Well, I'm going to assume that most of you are churched people, okay? I want to give you a little bit of background of what it's like for people on the outside. I myself am one of those people. I didn't grow up in church. I actually grew up in a troubled home where early on I experienced fighting in the home. I myself was forced into physical violence as a 5th grader. It was like a little kid's fight club, and I had to fist fight. I was forced to do that by my older brother who would assault me if I didn't do what he said. I learned what divorce meant at the age of 8, and I saw what I had known my whole life, my family, my siblings, the house that I grew up in, everything just be basically divided in half. Then I saw the emergence of a heavy drug use by my mother. My mother started using heavy drugs, heroin and methamphetamine. And when she had gone down this path of drug abuse, the abuse spilled over into, I was being abused by her. Mainly verbally, emotionally, and which ended up leading to abandonment. I was abandoned by my mom in 6th grade. It kind of came to a point. I'm leaving a lot of details out because I really don't want to focus on that. Let's just say that in 6th grade, I ended up going into the child care system of the state, where I spent 3.5 years in a boys' home in Laverne, California. I had developed very early on an anger problem. That was my way of protecting myself. You see, very early on, I was hurt by the people closest to me. I didn't know much about God. I didn't know much about love. And I certainly didn't know much about security. I kind of was just left to myself. And then I ended up getting out of the child care system when I was in 9th grade. So I was starting high school. And I was just getting reintroduced to public life. I eventually went on to meet the wrong type of friends. I know in high school that is like a proving ground to basically who you are. Who you hang out with and what you do in high school determines your identity. I took the identity of a skateboarder. I found that was actually something I was good at and I enjoyed, and therefore I hung out with the skateboarders. But with the skateboarding crowd comes all the other mess. Drugs, partying, drinking, rebelliousness towards the law. And that ended up leading me into being introduced to drugs myself. I started smoking weed, and then I started selling it. And I found out that I actually couldn't skateboard and be high at the same time. It actually threw my balance off. So I actually had to make a decision. Am I going to continue to skateboard and go down that route, or am I going to go down the party route? And I chose poorly, even against the fact that I experienced what drugs do to you firsthand by destroying my family. So I barely graduated high school because I was on the street a lot. My mom would kick me out. The troubles of my life didn't really seem to cease, and as I grew up into a young man, the anger only got worse, and I found myself regularly getting in street fights. And then things came to a point that after I graduated, my dad had been in prison most of my life after the divorce, and I didn't see him much. And we got to catch up in 2005, and this was a turning point for me. And while we were talking and catching up, he was kind of explaining to me really what had happened all those years ago. He also looked me in the eye and said that he had cancer. My dad, to me, maybe like some of you, was like this pillar, this immovable object. I really looked up to my dad, even though he wasn't really there. I felt like he really wasn't the one who had hurt me as much as it was my mom. And then 8 months later, he died. I couldn't believe it. And when he died, it really sent me into this downward spiral. The anger that I had experienced and was building up within me had turned into hatred. I hated the world, I hated people, and I hated the fact that the one parent that I actually thought was good to me was taken from me. Later that year, my brother gets out of prison. I have an older brother. You see, my brother, back when I was in 5th grade or so, He almost killed my stepdad with a golf club. He impaled him with the broken shaft of a golf club, and he was sent to prison as a juvenile. And I didn't see him for a long time. And he had been in and out of prison all those years because he had become institutionalized. My brother gets out. He couldn't even attend our dad's funeral because he was in prison, and it really hurt. And we start talking about life, and he used to be the older brother that pushed me around, and he would force me to fight in these little kid fight clubs. And now I'm a 20-something year, I'm 24 years old, and I'm a young man, and I'm quite a force of myself. And he starts talking to me about, oh, hey, my ex-girlfriend, she stopped writing me when I was in prison, and I didn't understand why, and, yada, yada, yada. Oh, she's seen this other guy, and that's my woman, her house is my house. And he wanted to borrow my truck to go beat this guy up and remove him physically from her house and take his girlfriend back. That's the kind of life that I grew up in. And you know what? I ended up agreeing to go with my brother. I didn't just let him borrow my truck, I took him. And I wanted to prove to my brother that I'm not this, you can't push me around anymore, I'm not this little kid. And I've got quite a reputation myself. You see, at this point in my life, I was selling drugs, I was doing illegal street racing, I had illegal firearms, and I was regularly getting in fights. I actually had developed a reputation where my friends would call me if they had a problem, and I would show up, and I usually got the job done. And so, having been living this way for many years, when my brother got out, I was like, well, this is nothing any different, and I actually have even more motive to want to back my brother. This is my brother. And we ended up going to the ex-girlfriend's house, and I ended up beating this guy nearly to death. And it could have killed him, and had put him in a state where he couldn't even walk, and he had to be picked up by an ambulance. I was out of control. I was out of control because everything that I had known in life and everything that I saw very early on about life and about the world was dark, it was cold, and it was bitter. And so that was how I dealt with my emotions. I didn't know how to talk about them, and I really didn't trust anyone to tell them to. I believed in God, I'd say. I remember I'd get high and drunk, and sometimes God would come up, and you'd have a bunch of ignorant people talking about God as if they know who He is. And like anyone, we just make up our own views. We would gather a little bit of stuff, truth here, maybe a little bit of truth here, and put it together, and then we basically make our own gods. And these gods usually would bow to us, and they would be the ones that would justify the way that we lived. I didn't know Christianity. I had been to church a few times, but I didn't know God. I thought the Bible, I really thought that this was a bunch of fairy tales. Man, God flooded the world, the dude built a boat, guys rising from the dead. Where's the water now? I'd never seen anyone rise from the dead. It didn't make sense. I didn't know any Christians, though. But because of what had happened at my brother's ex-girlfriend's house and the things that we had done, I found myself on the run from the law. I had a $100,000 warrant for my arrest, and I became a fugitive. I even had a sport bike at the time. I'm an avid motorcycle rider, and I had my first motorcycle then, and I had run from CHP on the freeway, and I got away because I had this warrant for my arrest. I was an outlaw. And it wasn't until I came to this point in my life where basically my life was being taken from me. Everything that I had known and the decisions that I had made up until this point, basically, it headed in me throwing my life away. And it took something so radical, like having my life basically taken from me, my freedom stripped of me, to really cause me to stop and consider who I am, what I'm doing, and how did I get here. I was miserable. I would get high and get drunk and mess with girls and do all this stuff and try to have this reputation and back up my friends. I tried to do all this because I was seeking meaning, purpose, and satisfaction. And it was fleeting. I had to get high. Every 45 minutes I had to smoke more. One girl was never enough. One beer was never enough. And you'd wake up the next morning saying, oh, it's time to do it all over again. And then you started to see that it was a futile life. And I found myself not satisfied. I was empty. And so this life-altering event of being on the run from the law, my friend turned the radio on one night. and it was a Christian radio station, and I heard the words of Jesus. And it's so interesting that after everything I had done and the person that I had become, God came to me in my darkest hour. I will never forget the words of Christ. He spoke them over 2,000 years ago as God in flesh walked amongst his own creation, and he preached. He talked about the kingdom of God. He told the people who the Father was. And then he came on a mission to save them. Even really messed up people like myself. And it was in Matthew 11, 20 through 30. I'll never forget these words. I never heard anyone speak like this. I mean, at this point, I'm trying to find any way I can get out of this. Unless you have invented a time machine that I can go back and reverse the thing that I did, it's set in motion. There's nothing I can do. It's just a matter of time till they come and throw me away in jail. And Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." You see, the weight of my sin was weighing on me so heavy that it started to bear itself in anxiety and fear, and my hair started falling out. I was under so much stress about what I had done and the reality that my life was forever going to be different. I tried to seek a way out by finding a lawyer. Couldn't afford him. I tried to find a way to flee the country. I didn't have a passport. There's nothing I can do. And it was when I came to rock bottom that then God showed up. Because I was willing to listen. And what does he say? He doesn't say, "Hey, you're a pretty filthy sinner. You know that thing you did?" No, he said, "Hey, come to me. I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm gentle in heart. You will find rest for your soul. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." I was like, I've never heard anyone talk like that. And not only that, but it's exactly what I need. I need rest. I feel like I'm carrying this burden that's like crushing me. And I don't know what's going to happen to me, and I certainly don't know what's going to happen to me when I die. And I don't feel very good about it, really. I actually didn't think that I would end up in heaven. It wasn't until a few days later that as I'm running through the hamster wheel of my own mind about everything that happened, how did I get here, why did I do that, and what can I do to get out of it, and the fact that I really couldn't change what I did. I had to face the music, and I was in despair. And those words of Christ, the Matthew 11, 20 through 30, the invitation of salvation that God gave to me over radio waves, came through to my conscience clear as day. And I remember I broke down and I prayed to this God I didn't know. And I came to him on the basis of the words of Jesus because I felt like I had nowhere else to go. And that's when everything changed. In a moment, in a flash, the burden was lifted off of me. In a flash, the fear and anxiety and despair turned to joy, peace, and confidence. For the first time in my life, the black hole, the dark hole of my human soul that just would suck everything like a gravitational pull. It would consume all sorts of sin and earthly pleasures and would still be empty, was finally filled. I jumped up out of my seat and I knew that God was real and Jesus was the way. And that because I had come to him and prayed to him, I had a realization of my sin. I knew that I didn't want to live that way anymore. I waved the white flag of my soul before God, said, "I'm done doing me. God, forgive me. Help me. I can't change who I am. I can't shake the anger. I can't stop smoking. I can't stop sleeping around. I can't stop hating. I'm so sorry for what I've done. I don't like who I've become. I can't change. God, give me a second chance." And that day, my whole life changed. I became born again. Because when that happened, all the chains, my anger was gone, my addictions were gone. I even stopped cussing. I found out about a church, and I started to find out about God because they were teaching this. And for the first time, when I tried to read the Bible before I became converted, it was like reading the book in the dark. It didn't make sense to me and wasn't interested in it. But when I became born again, the Holy Spirit started to illuminate the truth and teach me the truth. It's evidence that he dwells in you. And he became my translator and teacher. And I started to understand the meaning of life, why I'm here, who is God, the truth about heaven and hell, who Jesus is. You see, Christianity is not just a religion, it's not just a bunch of good rules, it's power. The kingdom of God is not just in talk, it's in power. Paul wrote that. And so what ended up happening? I was on the run. I was a fugitive. I was running, right? 3 months after I got saved, I got caught up on a search warrant and I went to jail. And I was looking at 8 to 15 years in prison for 6 felony violent crime cases, charges. It was a permanent record of 2 strikes in California. If you know this, if you get convicted of a violent felony, you get a strike on your permanent record. And if you get 3 at any point in your life, you will do life in prison. Right off the bat, I got 2 they're trying to give me. There's a lot of things that happened in jail. I don't have time to get into them. God revealed himself powerfully to me because when I was in jail, everything was gone. All I had was a paperback Bible. I didn't have my own bed. I mean, I had like this metal slat to sleep on with like a cushion that was so flattened by like the 600 men that slept on it before me. And an itchy army blanket. But I had a Bible and I started to read it. And I started seeking God, and God started to reveal himself to me through his word. And then God called me to preach the gospel in jail, and I preached the gospel to about 150 inmates. Blacks, whites, Asian, I don't care what color you are. You are made in God's image, just as I am. God made us for himself. Politics and racism is the way of Satan. God does not look upon the outer. He looks upon the heart. And I started to see God save people. God delivered me from 2